Welcome back to Market on Close. Let's keep going through the earnings. Apple so far the laggard in the aftermarket after huge gains in Meta and Amazon. Joining us, Ben Bajarin is the CEO and principal analyst at Creative Strategies. Ben, thanks for being on the Schwab Network this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so big wins for Meta, for Amazon, Apple a little bit more sluggish. Anything stand out in these numbers that's disappointing the market?
So the Mac was a little bit surprising to me, honestly. You look at PC sales, right? Usually in the Q4, those are pretty good. I think other vendors in the PC ecosystem had some strength there. iPad being down doesn't surprise me, but I do think a lot of people are going to look at that and say, what happened with iPads? Where was the driver sales? And obviously, I think there's still questions around China, even though, in my opinion, China is typically more of a seasonal for this current quarter because of Chinese New Year. So I'll be looking more at that for China, but that China weakness was offset by strength in other regions. So obviously, a good iPhone quarter, but the rest of the businesses had some interesting dynamics there in terms of the hardware category.
It's a good point on the iPads too, because generally, as though that hasn't been like a growth avenue for them, we did see a bunch of the computer-centric hardware businesses and PC businesses as well tell us all about the turning of the corner and the trough for demand, and even like at Best Buy and stuff. So I guess this would suggest that just the iPad's not that popular anymore.
Yeah, I think it's question two, right? Is that balancing out with success of the Mac? I mean, I think that had been sort of the case. You look at some of the record years that Mac has had sort of year over year, and some big quarters that they've sold more Macs than ever. I think that was a big question, right? Are people now buying Macs again and maybe not iPads? The challenge with all of this, I think, within Apple's ecosystem is that their hardware longevity, meaning the time that people own these products, continues to lengthen, which just makes the refresh cycles a little bit less predictable. And I think the last 2 years have been indicative of that in terms of some of the pockets of those hardware categories that have been up and down more than normal.
Okay. Looking at the China situation, is there hope for positive surprise? I mean, because it did look like the most well-telegraphed point of weakness, yet the market's down in this stock, and that was really the only real obvious negative that kind of stands out. So, like, are people still underestimating how bad it is there, or what?
I think they're either underestimating either how bad it is or the how long the length cycle of China in terms of how long they hold on to handsets has elongated. One of the hardest parts of that to predict over the last couple of years has been how the average age of handset in China has gone up. That was typically a market that recycled and upgraded very, very quickly. The one thing that's interesting about this category, and I do wonder whether or not there'll be some positive surprises for Apple and maybe a few others in the semiconductor ecosystem relative to China, is that it looks like ASPs are growing there, are rising, meaning the premium TAM is growing. The question, though, for that is now that Huawei is starting to make a ascent again back into the category, that's a big question as to how much of that they can challenge Apple again like they used to. It's very, very early in that, but you're seeing signs of Huawei coming back to premium. But the meta point is that premium growing, the high-end TAM growing is good for Apple, but they're now going to face that competition again from Huawei. And I think that this whole year will play out accordingly based on that competition.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. So they get a little bit of lift macro-wise with the ASPs rising, but if they can't keep up, then some competitive edge maybe that they're losing there. Huawei went through quite a bit of regulatory ordeal the past year. Is that mainly the limiting factor? When you talk about coming back, give me some more on that.
Yeah, so obviously they were up against some regulatory factors. They've diversified their own sort of platform in terms of a number of sub-brands that they have, but the brand itself is now making a push to come back. They're making some of their own silicon. They're obviously bringing devices out that are getting well received in the market. And so I think the big thesis had always been, Apple did benefit from Huawei's share loss. And so now the question is, will that share sort of come back to them in some form of category as more Chinese consumers look to be the high end? Again, it's an unanswered question. We know that iPhones typically are very, very strong in the region. There really isn't another premium player other than Huawei. But if Huawei can come in and maybe absorb some of that share back, that's a potential headwind for Apple with iPhones in China.
Okay. Let's talk vision for a moment as kind of the final piece of this puzzle. Getting a lot of press, getting a lot of attention, understandably. It's pretty wild looking. Everybody wants to know whether or not it's going to be a big part of their story. Mathematically, I guess not yet, right, for earnings or anything, but commentary, what are you looking for?
Yeah, so I think they're going to come out and just say, look, demand has been overwhelmingly positive. The reviews were pretty positive for most people. My guess is that they'll talk that up. Obviously, they're not going to report sales. We probably won't see any report of sales this year, probably not even next year. It's not going to be a meaningful contribution to revenue, but they're obviously trying to present this as a future category that they believe can be quite big, be complementary to their hardware ecosystem, and be a solid standalone business of itself. And I think, as everybody can appreciate, right, one of the big stories from Apple is not just can they continue to grow year over year top line revenue, but what businesses can continue to grow. That's not just iPhone, right? Services gets brought up a lot, wearables gets brought up a lot, and those have been healthy businesses. But we need more of these things like Vision Pro to be successful in order to keep adding new business revenue, new lines of business to Apple to drive revenue and to continue driving that top line growth. So you're absolutely right. Slow story for now. This is all about where are we going to be in 4 or 5 years. Apple's planting that seed. And so we'll see. It's an evolving story, but at least we've got some other hardware product category to talk about, which could someday be very, very meaningful to top line revenue.
All right, well said. Ben, great stuff. Thanks for your contribution. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Ben Bajarin is the CEO and principal analyst at Creative Strategy. Some good thoughts there on Apple.